Nicole, for somebody that hasn't made the connection yet between mental illness and what they're putting in their mouth, let's start out really broad and talk about why what we eat matters for our brain health.
So very, very broadly, something that people really can't quite or don't understand because they haven't really been educated about it, or it hasn't been the focus of education, is that your ability to make energy in your brain, and for your brain to have good mitochondrial health and to have all the micronutrients it needs and the amino acids it needs in order to make your neurotransmitters and fight neuroinflammation. Food directly affects that. Your choices directly affect that. And that is foundational and preventative and something that our society just has not paid attention to at all. This idea that what we eat is completely disconnected from how we are functioning or what we're able to handle or what our capacity is not reflective of how the human brain and the human body work.
Well, there's a lot of information out there, a lot of conflicting information on what to eat in general. How does somebody begin to piece together a diet to heal the brain?
The first thing that you really need to do is you need to understand the limitations of different research models. And that might seem like a very counterintuitive place to begin, but it's actually very, very important because many of the things that we are told to eat or are told that have benefit actually come from epidemiological studies. And epidemiological studies, by their very nature, are hypothesis generating. They are not an area of scientific inquiry that is supposed to inform guidelines. They're not made for that. And part of that is because the way data is accumulated for epidemiological studies are in ways such as food frequency questionnaires, where, for example, if someone asked you or I what we ate that week, we would have a heck of a time telling them what it was and exactly how much. And it would be very general. And so, if you had a hot dog, it wouldn't, we wouldn't know what brand it was or what quality of meat it was or any, things like that. And so, how much broccoli did you have on your plate, and so on and so forth. So these food frequency questionnaires are flawed by definition. And then we make these very general recommendations based on that. The other thing that really, really, really must stop is picking food choices based on, I would say, ideas about what is morally a high ground. So we can talk more about that because I think that is fascinating and very interesting. But sometimes these epidemiological studies are used by special interest groups to promote a particular agenda that may not actually be consistent with what we understand about human biology. And so that's another piece. So really, you have to kind of understand what your studies are based on. And I really like to make my recommendations based on what we know about human biochemistry, as opposed to epidemiological studies. Or, I'm very particular about, okay, so whose agenda does this study promote? And is that based in human biochemistry, or is that based on some kind of agenda about how they want or think the world should work?
Okay, so somebody brand new to this, they want to start to head in the direction we're alluding to here. How do you recommend they begin? Is it with macros, eliminating certain foods, including certain foods? Let's walk into it from the beginning and give the full playbook.
So the very, very first thing that people can do who want to walk into this is to understand that a lot of the foods on the shelves, what's called highly processed foods, are more like drugs than food. So they have to stop thinking about those as food and think about them much more as substances. They're substances that are sold commercially in the guise of food. And so my personal definition of what a food is does it feed my body? Does it increase my micronutrient stores? Does it provide me usable amino acids? Does it nurture me, or does it take away from my vitality in some way, shape, or form? And so when you put that bar to highly processed foods, it fails miserably. So what I would want your listeners to understand is that a lot of the highly processed foods, a lot of them use proteins, for example, that are not very bioavailable. Many of them are so high in carbohydrates that they actually deplete micronutrient stores of things like magnesium and thiamine. And so you're actually worse off nutritionally after eating them than you were when you began. There's also a lot of concerns about some of the highly processed industrialized oils and fats that are used in these highly processed foods. And here in the US, there are a lot of chemicals and substances and flavorings and things that have been banned elsewhere around the world for very good reason, that our government, for some reason, and I won't expound on that, but there's some reason that we're not being protected from that in our food supply. And so if there was just one thing I could have someone do for their mental health that hopefully would not be overwhelming, would be to start to think about these substances in that way so that they can start to move them out of their diet and to actually replace them with whole foods. And some people think about those highly processed food substances as a major source of pleasure, right? Like some people are really struggling, and those highly processed foods are how they try to regulate their own brain chemistry in the moment without an understanding of what the downstream effects of that decision are. But I would say if anyone is having any kind of motivational issue around getting rid of those substances, it's really important to remember that your drug dealer really doesn't have your best interest at heart. They really just want your money. They don't understand or they don't care, I should say. I'm sure they understand. They don't care how disruptive that is to your mood and functioning an hour later or 2 to 3 days later. Your drug dealer doesn't care about you, and they don't care about your quality of life. And so if you feel some allegiance to that drug dealer who is a highly processed food seller, then that's something that you need to kind of address and think about really carefully. Those are not your friends.
Okay, so first step, ultra-processed foods, they're out. Seed oils, in that category, we want to remove those. Mm-hmm. You mentioned going to whole foods. For somebody that's tried that, still not seeing the results when it comes to their mental health, what's the next step?
So a whole foods diet, a good quality paleo type of diet, a lot of people, it's actually very abundant in carbohydrate, and sometimes that's just what people need, and they're doing just fine with it. And they don't need to look at different diets necessarily. But the next step down, I would say, if you are not getting mood stability, and I also want to say sometimes you don't realize how poorly functioning you are until you fix it. And so there's lots of people on paleo diets that are feeling better than they did before they got rid of highly processed foods and stuff, but they still aren't actually aware that there's a whole nother next level that they could be feeling better at. And so I encourage anyone listening to be curious about, what's possible for me, because that is kind of a fun thing to explore. So the next step would be to get a low carb food list. And I would say just eat off of that low carb food list. If it's not on that food list, you don't eat it. You're not counting macros. You're not counting calories. You're not counting, checking whether you got enough protein or too little or whatever. You just are reducing carbohydrate intake overall, just eating simply off of a low carb food list. You think about that food list when you dine at a restaurant, that sort of thing.
You made it to the end of this clip, which means you're going to love the full episode. Head on over here to watch, and I'll see you over there.
Sometimes you don't realize how poorly functioning you are until you fix it. There are areas of hypometabolism that occur in mental illness. So if I've got parts of my brain